Sean and I just agreed in January where things were flying kind of shut down for work. Oh, cool, yeah. I used to live up that way too. For school. You're on the red line, second Somerville, yeah. Actually, I was waiting outside the state house right now. I said I was going to be there in like 3 minutes, but I ended up being like 6. So I saw one of the troopers. What's better? It's been like an hour since the game. Took me an hour to catch up to the world started. So that's why we were standing at the tunnel. She's doing a lot of ridiculous when I do get on the team, very rarely, I have them see what and then, there's just the aspects of how to know it's like or that specifically, the first few months up here. I know. Either way. I can tell myself
Plenty of room on this side. So good afternoon. We're all here today to talk about the next favorite day in April after Marathon Monday, and that's Tax Day. And for the people of the country and the people of the Commonwealth, this is a day on which we are all reminded about what exactly our contribution, our required contribution, looks like to the state of Massachusetts and to the federal government. And we think there's no better time than Tax Day to talk about why we should be investing in the people of Massachusetts whose hard work has generated an enormous surplus here and providing them in a high inflation environment where the cost of basically everything for them is going up to give them the breaks that they deserve. And in our particular situation, that would mean giving our renters a break who are seeing their rent costs go up, giving senior homeowners a break who are seeing their cost of living go up, giving families who have had a very difficult couple of years with the COVID pandemic a break on their dependent expenses, giving basically all of those folks here in the Commonwealth who have really performed in a very significant way over the course of this pandemic a chance to get back some of the money that they're losing as a result of the rising price of basically everything. The folks who are here today all represent a variety of points of view. They are, in many respects, considered to be the respected advocate on behalf of their particular point of view or their position, but they're all here to basically say the same thing, which is at a point in time when the cost of everything is going up, when the Commonwealth of Mass has a surplus almost beyond imagination relative to historical precedent, it's time to make sure that we give back some of that surplus to the people who helped put it there in the first place, which are the taxpayers and the workers and the families here in the Commonwealth of Mass. And with that, I will turn it over to Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you, Gov. Yes, today is tax day, and millions of Massachusetts residents have spent this past tax season filling out their returns. But there's no question that over this past year, these have been difficult times, including the high cost of living, not only here in the Commonwealth, but across our nation, as goods cost more, services cost more, and inflation continues to be a challenge, especially for low-income workers. And at the same time, as the governor stated, our coffers are filling up. Revenues beat projections by $856 million in January, $293 million in February, and $427 million in March. It clearly is time to give some of these tax dollars back to the residents of Massachusetts. I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically about housing costs, which also continue to be a challenge for our residents. As many of you know, we've done a lot to help increase the production of housing with the passage of the Housing Choice Reform, significant investments along with our colleagues in the legislature in affordable housing starts across our Commonwealth. But clearly, targeted tax relief will also go a long way to help both renters and seniors. Our bill will increase rental deduction cap from $3,000 to $5,000, and that would create a significant savings for renters. It would allow approximately 881,000 Massachusetts residents to keep approximately $77 million each year. For example, this tax cut would save renters in a total of $34 million each year in the 20 equity communities that we have identified as the hardest hit communities in our Commonwealth. Our plan would also double the maximum senior circuit breaker credit for more than 100,000 lower income homeowners and renters aged 65 and older. The credit is adjusted annually for inflation, and in 2021, this change would have raised the credit to $2,340. That's significant for lower income seniors in our Commonwealth. We are grateful to have the support of the individuals who will speak after Secretary Heffernan, but I also want to highlight a significant group well recognized here in this Commonwealth as being a supporter of our proposal to help seniors in our Commonwealth. Our friends from AARP Massachusetts support these two housing provisions, as well as our proposal to increase the dependent care credit. Mike Fester from AARP was not able to join us today, but he did submit a quote, and I'd like to read that. AARP strongly urges action now. Measures such as tax credits and other financial assistance, or both, to Massachusetts' 844,000 caregivers, doubling the maximum senior circuit breaker credit and increasing the rental deduction cap, help lower and middle income residents and their families achieve increased health and financial security and facilitate their ability to age in their home and in community. We are so grateful to have their support and certainly bring the urgency along with these stakeholder groups to seeing this action now. And our legislative colleagues to take this seriously and to evaluate the current state of conditions here in our Commonwealth that justify this targeted tax relief happening. It's a responsible and right thing to do. The taxpayers that are impacted deserve this break. I'd now like to turn it over to Secretary Heffernan.
Good afternoon. As the governor and the lieutenant governor have underscored, we are at an important point on the road to economic recovery here in Massachusetts. Just as our residents are climbing out of turbulence of the pandemic, they are facing an increasingly expensive and unaffordable world. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth's finances are at a historically strong position. Through March, our state tax collections are $3.6 billion more than we had initially projected for fiscal year 22. And this comes on the back of a $5 billion surplus in state tax revenues in fiscal year 2021. The balance of our stabilization fund, the rainy day fund, has never been more healthy, currently sitting at an all-time high balance of $4.6 billion. And it is on track to be more than $6 billion by the end of fiscal '23. We have made massive investments in acute areas of need throughout the pandemic. Among them, over $1 billion towards stabilizing childcare, more than $1 billion in housing and rental assistance for individuals and families in crisis, more than $700 million to support small and diverse businesses, and hundreds of millions to support the critical work done in human service providers. As our state finances continue their strong performance, there is still significant federal funding available to support key areas that remain in need for coming years. This includes over $2 billion in remaining ESSER funds that fund K-12 schools across the Commonwealth, more than $5 billion in funding from the American Rescue Plan, or ARPA, to support a wide range of initiatives over the next several years, and billions for transportation and environmental initiatives through the recently enacted federal bipartisan infrastructure legislation. The Commonwealth has ample resources, both state and federal, to continue investing in priority areas like childcare, education, housing, workforce, economic development, and more, all while implementing these impactful state tax relief measures. It's time to make a targeted investment directly in those who were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and who continue to face the steepest climb in regaining stability. We can afford to provide this tax relief, and we believe that the returning some of our surplus state tax revenue is the right thing to do, to provide much-needed relief to hundreds of thousands of hard-working taxpayers after 2 very difficult years, and to improve our competitiveness as a state and help ensure the continued strength of our economy in the long term. We have a great opportunity before us, and we are hopeful that the legislature will work with us to make these tax policies a reality. And now I'll pass it over to my good friend Eileen McEnany from the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Governor Baker, Lieutenant Governor Polito, Secretary Heffernan, for the opportunity to be here. I'm Eileen McEnany, President of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. MTF's mission is about fiscal stability for the Commonwealth and positioning us for long-term economic growth and opportunity for all. And the Baker administration's tax package achieves both, and that's why I'm proud to stand before you today endorsing this proposal. With respect to fiscal stability, the package is affordable. We have an all-time high balance in the stabilization fund, as Secretary Heffernan pointed out, tax revenues exceeding projections by billions of dollars for 2 fiscal years in a row, and billions more at the state's disposal in the form of federal assistance. This is an appropriate time to provide the people of Massachusetts with much-needed tax relief, particularly now against a backdrop of inflation. This package provides relief to the most vulnerable among us, to seniors, to young families, to those of modest incomes, and does so efficiently and predictably by using the tax code to deliver the money. This package also signals that Massachusetts is choosing to compete, to borrow a phrase from Harvard Business School professor Michael Porter, by eliminating 2 outlier practices, the short-term capital gains rate of 12% and some of the more onerous provisions in the estate tax. Massachusetts is making itself a more inviting place for innovators, for investors, for small business owners, for retirees. They can come to our great state. They can plant roots. They can create jobs here, and they can take advantage of all that we have to offer. The pandemic has changed the way that people work and live and provided them with greater locational flexibility than ever before. And this change and the loss of workforce that Massachusetts has been experiencing throughout the pandemic makes having a proactive strategy to retain and attract talent critical to our future economic vitality. The governor's tax package represents an important initial step, and MTF is proud to support it. I would now like to introduce Amy Pitter with the Massachusetts Society of CPAs.
Thanks, Eileen. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd also like to thank the governor, lieutenant governor, and the secretary for having us here today and also for their vision. I'd like to really support everything Eileen said about competitiveness and fiscal stability, but I also want to give a different flavor. As head of the Massachusetts Society of CPAs, people have asked me, well, isn't complex tax law good for your members? It gives them more work to do. Well, the answer is no. What it does is prevents our members from doing what they really want to do, which is advising their small business and other clients on how to be successful in Massachusetts, and diverts their attention to following arcane rules. And the thing I really want to focus on is the conformity bill that is in the governor's package and is also in the House package. So Massachusetts is linked to the IRC, the Internal Revenue Code of 2005, which was a very long time ago. When I was at DOR in like 2007, 2008, we were saying, gosh, this is getting stale, isn't it? Well, here it is 2022, and we're still linked to 2005. So what that does is it has no economic purpose, it has no policy purpose, it just makes things complicated. And frankly, it makes us look a little stale ourselves, right? Like, why are we not keeping up? Why are we the only state linked to 2005? Most other states, I think, no more than 2 or 3 years old, and here we are, back to 2005. So I really want to thank the governor and the speaker for both including this important reform in their packages. It will make things simpler for taxpayers, simpler for tax practitioners, and frankly, simpler for the Department of Revenue. You know, every time you make tax laws more complex and less easy to understand, you increase the cost of compliance, you increase resistance to compliance, and you increase that sort of intangible sense that we're Taxachusetts. So something as simple and with so little economic downside as updating the code just makes us look like we're responsive to taxpayers, so super important. Other things around simplicity, Eileen talked a little bit about the estate tax. That's another thing where we're an outlier. Anytime we're an outlier and we're doing things dramatically different from other states, it makes things more complicated and it makes us less inviting as a state. So we're way out of the mainstream on the estate tax, and the governor's package will put us a little bit closer to where other states that even have an estate tax are. And short-term gains is another one. Why have two kinds of capital gains when it's simpler and easier to comply when you only have one? So that concludes my remarks. Again, just going for simplicity. Thanks so much to the governor for including that. And now I'm happy to turn it over to John Hurst from the Retailers Association.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here this afternoon. Look, our taxpayers are also consumers, and consumers shop on Main Street. They represent 70% of our economy, and it's important for our Main Street, it's important for our small businesses that we retain those consumers, retain those taxpayers in the Commonwealth. There was a bad omen that came up through the U.S. Census the end of last year, the end of December. Massachusetts was ranked 4th worst on population loss. We were behind those states of New York, California, and Illinois. That's a bad omen. We need to turn that around. And two things working against that right now are tax laws and inflation. And, you know, inflation, really, our consumers really only look for really reasonable basic goals. You know, they want to be able to have a safe, nice home for their families. They want to provide food, clothing, entertainment costs. They want to provide a good education. And when that time comes, they want to be able to save a little bit of money to be able to have an affordable retirement and stay where they are. And if they're fortunate enough, maybe pass on a few of those dollars onto their children when they pass. That's becoming harder and harder today. And we need to look at what's causing that loss of population and why that's harder in Massachusetts than it is in other states. This tax package really is an important balance that we need to look at. Now, no matter where you are in your stages of life, whether you're starting out or you're retiring, There are important taxes and important costs that we're all facing, and they're getting harder today with inflation. You know, the governor and I are old enough to remember the last bout of inflation, 40 years ago. I was telling the governor my very first mortgage that I got was 12 5/8. Let's hope that was 40 years ago. Let's hope we're not going there. But I can tell you one thing, the cost at the checkout line is getting exorbitant for our working families. And yes, their incomes are up. And in fact, the average weekly wage in Massachusetts went up 14% last year. That probably means for the tax man some pretty good collections on income taxes today. Retail sales is of course, when prices go up at the checkout line, so does the sales tax collections. Sales tax collections in Massachusetts went up 20% last month. And as the value of our homes, whether we're buying through a mortgage or we're renting, as the values of those properties go up, so do the real estate taxes. So the tax man is winning, whether it's on real estate taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, yet the consumer, the taxpayer, is losing. And we need to ask ourselves, who best to really decide where to spend those dollars, how to invest those dollars in their families, in their communities? Who is that? Is that the taxpayer or the tax collector? We need to do this. The Commonwealth has never seen so much money coming into its coffers, and we need to give some of that back to our hardworking taxpayers to make sure that they and their families feel comfortable, can afford to live here, and they stay here. Thank you. And next is John Regan from Maine.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here, as others before me have thanked the governor, lieutenant governor, and the secretary for the opportunity to be here. I'm John Regan. I'm the president and CEO of Associated Industries of Massachusetts, or AIM. We represent 3,300 companies all across the Commonwealth, from the Berkshires to the Atlantic Ocean, and we are pleased to support this recommendation from the Baker-Polito administration relative to reform of some of the tax code items that have been discussed at length already. I'll be very brief. I think the most salient point for us, and we've testified to this fact before the general court, is that the state is awash in money, and the people could really use a break. It's been a rough 2 years, and anything that we can do to help people ease the transition from the pandemic into the post-pandemic time would be wise and appropriate, and AIM is pleased to support the passage of this legislation. And with that, I'd be happy to introduce Karyn Ryan from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, and Secretary, for inviting the Chamber to be here today. Like the others before us, we strongly support this proposal, and it's about competitiveness for the Greater Boston Chamber. Massachusetts has benefited from a strong talent pool for decades, but the rise of remote work and states trying to lure away Massachusetts residents and employers are both real threats to our long-term economic health. Other states are advertising on billboards, and they're targeting Massachusetts with proactive attraction strategies for both talent and businesses. After decades of knowing that the region's workforce quality and business ecosystems were enough to attract and keep businesses and jobs here, it's time to shift our thinking. The Commonwealth must begin to be proactive in its efforts. First, to keep what we already have, and second, to attract new talent and new businesses. Residents, families, and small business owners must feel confident in the future of Massachusetts as a place where everyone can successfully live and work. This proposal does that by creating a more competitive tax environment in ways that matter to residents and small businesses. For workers, it increases the credit for dependents, increases the renter's deduction, and raises the threshold for no tax status. For small business owners, it raises the estate tax threshold so that they can confidently build a business knowing that it will help provide for their families. Massachusetts residents invest in our Commonwealth through their work, their businesses, and their commitment to the region. With these changes, policymakers will send a signal to the talent and small business owners that drive our economy that they are paramount to the future of the Commonwealth. And with that, I will turn it back to the governor.
Start on topic with me or any of the folks who are here.
House leaders in particular, have not really embraced this yet. The bills are still in play, but they seem to be arguing that the surplus revenue should be used to prompt new spending rather than offer tax breaks. Can you just talk a little bit more about what other spending you have supported and why exactly you want to do this in the form of tax breaks rather than expanding more money into early ed and care, public transportation, anything like that?
Well, a number of areas that we put significant resources into in our budget. And honestly, when you think about the size of the surpluses we're talking about, and Secretary Heffernan walked through those in his remarks, we can afford to give money back to the taxpayers. And when you're talking about the fact that the federal government has a kinder no tax status than the Commonwealth of Mass does, and we claim to be one of the most progressive states in the country in terms of what we do for low-income taxpayers, and in this case, low-income wage earners, who in this case happen to be taxpayers, I think we should step up and do the right thing on behalf of those folks. We have some of the fastest growing rental costs in the country. We haven't raised that rental deduction in decades. Again, there are hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom are living paycheck to paycheck, who would benefit enormously from a decision to give them back some of the money that they currently put out the door to keep a roof over their heads. With respect to the tax changes on dependent care, I don't need to give you the details on that one. You heard them from some of the speakers. There's a tremendous opportunity here to do something that would be really special for families and for caregivers, which we should take advantage of. I mean, I don't look at this tax package and say to myself, is this the sort of thing that we should trade off against this or that? The Commonwealth's in a very unique and unusual position where we have the ability to continue to adequately support and fund our state programs and our local governments. Cities and towns currently have $2 billion in federal ESSER money that they haven't put to work yet. The Commonwealth has billions of dollars in federal money it hasn't put to work yet. We're currently running a budget surplus that is billions of dollars above our original benchmark for the second year in a row. These are billions with a B. We're talking about a $700 million tax proposal, the vast majority of which goes to low-income earners, seniors, families, and especially the estate thing. We are such an outlier on the estate tax. There's no state in America that taxes estates from a first dollar forward, and we're the only state other than Oregon that starts taxing estates at $1 million. But in Oregon, the tax hit actually doesn't begin until you get over the $1 million. Many houses in Massachusetts are now worth $1 million. If you just leave your house to your children in Massachusetts, you'll be paying estate tax from $1 on the value of that house. There's a reason why many Democrats in the legislature and Republicans support one version or another of virtually every tax proposal we've made here. And the reason is they've heard from their constituents that these things are issues and they would like to see relief. On the estate tax in particular, there's a big coalition of Democrats and Republicans who support doing something about the estate tax because they have watched many of their residents leave and move and take with them their income, their philanthropy, and everything else to other states simply because they don't want to die and have to start paying at $1 at $1 million to the Commonwealth of Mass. And I just think this is an extraordinary opportunity to do something for a bunch of people who deserve the relief, and we should go there.
I have a follow-up question to that. Because the House budget includes more targeted spending more than your original proposal, is the state in a position, in a fiscal position to do both, to increase the targeted spending that the House wants to do and do the proposal that you're making?
I think at the end of it, we're talking about a $50 billion House budget, okay? Our budget, I think, was 48 and change. I think there's plenty of room there to figure out some way to make sure that we make the investments we all need to make on behalf of the people of Massachusetts. I think ours was a 2.5% increase. I think the House was more like 5%.
Do you believe this plan will help Massachusetts lose its nickname of Taxachusetts?
I certainly think there are a lot of people out there struggling with 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10% year-over-year increases in a lot of the goods and services that they buy, who are scratching their heads and wondering why the Commonwealth of Mass, when we have billions of dollars in surplus revenue, isn't trying to do something to give it back to them.
Last question. Governor, off topic.
Sure.
Can I ask you about the masks on the T? We're hearing the state is going to be lifting a mandate for masks on the T. What goes into that decision and why now?
Well, first of all, I think what we would say, obviously the federal government's changed the rules with respect to this based on that court decision that was issued. And I believe that the original extension that was issued by the CDC was only going to last until, it was a 2-week extension basically from today until the beginning of May. I think at this point we're taking a look at both the federal decision that was rendered by the judge in Florida, as well as some of the existing rules that are out there, and making what we will consider to be as the right decision, both as a practical matter and as a policy matter for people here in Massachusetts. One thing I will say is that we've been pretty good as a Commonwealth about giving people space if they feel they need to wear a mask. If they want to wear a mask because they have unvaccinated people in their family, because they're unvaccinated, because they have they live with people who have immunocompromised circumstances, or they themselves are immunocompromised. There's plenty of guidance out there about when and why and what circumstances people should continue or consider wearing a mask. But I think it's important for us to make our decision based on both the policy matter, the legal matter, and the practical issues that are involved in this.
So has the decision actually been made? Cases are going up. Do you think we're in a different position now to be making that, to be lifting that mandate?
Well, 80% of the people in Massachusetts are fully vaccinated, and among those over the age of 65, it's more like 95% of the people are fully vaccinated. We now have therapies we didn't have 2 years ago that actually work. Both, we have oral therapies that are now available, which you can get through a prescription, which are very widely available and continue to be used, and we also continue to have other kinds of therapeutics available. None of that existed when this pandemic began. Those are big changes in terms of how we should be thinking about the way we deal with it going forward.
So Governor, just to clarify, has a decision been made on the transit system to lift the mask mandate?
There's still conversations going on it, and when we finish those, we'll obviously let you know.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
One more question, just on the RMV and the licensing.
Yep.
For people who did take those licenses, we found out that more than half of them did not pass. What do you make of that?
I think that's part of the reason why that investigation was so important in the first place, and why it was important to make everybody come back and take the test. There was a lot of conversation when that whole thing began about the length of time it took the RMV to finish the investigation. My view was they needed to make sure they tracked every single record they needed to track to be comfortable that they got everybody into that tent that they needed to get into the tent. So when they did put out that requirement, and you may recall there was some grumpiness about that, everybody who they believed was part of the original scam would have to come in and retake the test. And I think the results of that speak for themselves.
Thanks, guys.
Governor,
Thanks.
after tax breaks, have you spoken with the House Speaker since the reveal to get a better understanding of what other tax breaks could be in the works, and what have your conversations looked like, if anything, with the Senate President right now on what she could be proposing?
You know, generally speaking, those kinds of conversations are between us. What I would say is that there have been discussions and conversations about these, not just among folks at the leadership level, but a lot of the folks in the legislature have had conversations with people on our team about a number of these tax proposals as well. The biggest thing usually has to do with who benefits, where do they live, and is this something that adds up to an amount of money that's consistent with what I expected it would add up to. I think in many respects, these tax breaks, you're talking about millions of people when you put them all together who would benefit here in the Commonwealth of Mass, the vast majority of whom no one would ever describe as high income. And I think we should pursue them.
The chances that your bill gets reported out favorably from the Joint Committee on Revenue?
Pardon me?
The chances that your bill comes out favorably from the Joint Committee on Revenue?
There's a long way to go between now and the end of the year, and if there's one thing I've learned in this particular business over my 7 years here and my 8 years with Bill Weld and Paul Salucci, is predictions on how the legislative process are going to work usually end badly.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Governor, is there any sort of big difference if that happens through the budget or as a standalone bill in your tax bag? I just know that you made this sort of a centerpiece
Yeah.
of your annual budget filing. The House is considering it as standalone legislation. Is there a big distinction there, or do you think either route is really viable at this point?
I think either one works. The one thing I would say about this is I think one of the reasons why some of this stuff is going to happen in a different way than it might have happened before is because the legislature and the rest of us have all been dealing with the pandemic for the better part of the past 2 years, and there's a lot. I'd be the first to agree. There's a lot on the plate between now and the end of July. You know, our healthcare bill got filed maybe 6 weeks ago. The Mass Track, which was our response to the bipartisan infrastructure law, got filed fairly recently. I mean, there's a lot that's going on and a lot that will need to go on. And I think dealing with this in or out of the budget process, I mean, it's not that hard to reconcile one way or the other. And we've done tax policy outside of the budget process several times over the course of the past 10 years or so. That by itself, I'm not worried about.
Thanks,
Thanks.
guys.
Thanks again for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Just lost 10 pounds.